I bought an antique train set from a flea market. I think it's haunted by a post-World War II tragedy. This all started 3 weeks ago at the biggest antique fair in the state. I was looking for period-appropriate rolling stock for a new layout, something with that specific, heavy feel of post-war North America, maybe a pre-war German piece if I was lucky. Tucked away in the back corner, under a stack of moth-eaten blankets, I found it. A complete train set in a wooden latched box. The seller, an old woman with eyes that seemed to know too much, said it was a one-off, maybe handmade, from the late 1940s. The engine was a gorgeous, heavy 462 Pacific type, dark green with red detailing. The scale was slightly off, maybe O-gauge or a hair smaller, but the craftsmanship was incredible. It wasn't Lionel or Marklin. It felt real somehow. "It needs to go to a good home," she'd said, accepting my cash far too easily. "It's been waiting for someone to run it again." That night, I cleaned the engine. The metal was tarnished but sturdy. The wheels turned perfectly. It took some modifying of my track to get the gauge right, but by Saturday morning I had it ready for a test run on a temporary loop in my basement workshop. I flicked the power on. The engine didn't just move, it shuddered to life. A faint but distinct scent of coal smoke, damp earth, and something metallic, like old oil and rust, filled the air, even though the engine was fully electric and cold. The sound was the first real clue. It wasn't the electrical hum of the motor. It was the rhythmic, heavy chuff, chuff, chuff of a genuine steam locomotive, magnified and yet muffled, like it was coming from inside a box. It wasn't loud, but it was persistent, a mechanical heartbeat in my quiet basement. I ran it for a few minutes. It was mesmerizing. It had this strange momentum. When I cut the power, it coasted for what seemed like twice as long as any other model I owned, finally settling with a sharp, sighing hiss. Then the first incident happened. I went upstairs to grab a coffee. When I returned, the 4 boxcars I'd coupled behind the engine had rearranged themselves. The livestock car, which I'd placed third, was now first, right behind the tender. My layout is just a simple oval, no complex switches or shunting yards. It was impossible for the cars to have moved without external force. I dismissed it as vibrations, or maybe I had misremembered the order. But the livestock car was the unsettling part. It was empty when I left. Now, if I held my ear close to the wooden slats, I could hear the faint, high-pitched bleating of sheep. Not a recording. It was tinny, desperate, and cold. I started running the train in the evenings after work. I tried to ignore the subtle shift in the air, the constant faint smell of coal smoke. I even tried to set up my phone to record, but every time I did, the train would refuse to run. The power was on, the tracks were clean, but it would just sit there, silent and still, until I turned the camera off. The movement became deliberate. Every night I ran it, the 4 cars would be subtly different the next morning. Sometimes a car would be derailed. Sometimes a coupling would be undone. The car left sitting alone in the middle of the track, and the sounds intensified. The second car, a simple black oil tanker, started to drip. Not real oil, but a thick, dark, viscous liquid that stained the wooden track bed. It smelled of fuel, of a burned petroleum stench that was acrid and sickening. When I tried to wipe it up, it evaporated, leaving behind a faint smudge of soot and the smell. The third car, an open gondola meant for carrying scrap iron, started to show its cargo. Before, it had just a few painted lumps. Now, tiny, detailed pieces of miniature metal were sitting inside. A miniature gas mask canister, a tiny rusted rifle bolt, a shredded piece of what looked like a miniature uniform. When I tried to pick them up, they were freezing cold, and I felt a brief, overwhelming sense of panic. The kind you get when a ceiling is collapsing on you. I dropped the piece, and when I looked back, the gondola was empty again. The fourth car, a simple caboose, was the worst. I started hearing a low, strained singing coming from it. It was a man's voice, humming a tune I didn't recognize. It sounded less like a song and more like a way to cope with terror. The sound was faint, choked, and full of raw desperation. I was getting almost no sleep. The image of the train, chuffing along in the dark basement, smelling of ash and cold metal was constant in my mind. I knew, with a certainty that chilled me to the bone, that the train wasn't just haunted, it was a repeating, miniature echo of a specific, horrible journey. I needed to find out what this train was. I went back to the antique fair's organizer and asked about the old woman. It took 2 days of calling and showing people a picture of the unique engine before someone recognized the style. They gave me the name of an old rail yard worker who used to dabble in folk art models. I tracked down the worker, an elderly man named George, who lived outside the city. He looked at the photo of the train on my phone and went white. "Where did you get that?" he asked, his voice shaking. I told him about the old woman. "That's Marta's set," he whispered. "The ghost train." George explained that in late 1948, he was a yard boy near the city. The war was over, but the cleanup and transport of goods and people were still chaotic. There was a specific unmarked freight run that came through the marshalling yard late every Saturday night. It was an unofficial, unlisted train, an engine and 4 cars. It stopped for just a few minutes, never opened its doors, and then moved on. One night the train stopped, but the engine didn't move on. It just sat there, steam hissing, for hours. George said his friend, a guard named Arthur, snuck closer. Arthur saw a man, a very young man, barely more than a boy, in the caboose's rear window. The man looked out, pale and frantic, and he tapped a message on the glass. "Help." Arthur knew something was wrong. He grabbed a lantern and ran up to the first car, the livestock car. He held the lantern up to the slats. The car wasn't full of sheep. It was full of people. George choked out. Displaced persons, refugees, moving them across borders probably. They were weak. They were dying of cold and starvation. And they were screaming in fear as soon as Arthur's light hit them. Arthur tried to unlatch the door. Before he could, the conductor, a man known to everyone as the foreman, appeared from the tender. The foreman didn't say a word. He just hit Arthur with a heavy steel coupling pin. Arthur survived, but he was left crippled. The foreman got back on the engine, and the train, 4 cars in all, pulled away with a screech of steel that sounded like a cry of pain. It derailed 3 miles down the line in the deep marshland. Total washout. Engine flipped, cars smashed, no official record of the cargo. They said it was a mechanical failure. They found the conductor, the engineer, and the young boy from the caboose, all dead, and no one mentioned the passengers. "Marta's set," I said softly. "Marta was the engineer's wife," George explained. "She never believed her husband was just careless. She made that set, all by hand, a perfect replica. She said she was building the train that never made it, the one that was stuck in the marsh forever. She thought if she ran it enough, if she kept the engine moving, she could get them across the line, that she could finish the trip they never finished in reality." I drove home in a daze. The story explained the model, the feel of dread, the cargo, the livestock car of people, the oil car of fuel for a journey, the gondola with the remnants of uniforms and supplies, and the caboose where the young man was singing to keep his courage. I went straight to the basement, determined to stop running the train. It was sitting on the track. The 4 cars were in a perfect, straight line. I walked toward the caboose. That smell, coal smoke, damp earth, metallic fear, was overpowering. I looked in the rear window of the caboose. The tiny, painted figure of the young man was looking out, but his face wasn't painted. It was a faint, shimmering point of light. And then I realized the twist. I remembered what George had said. They found the conductor, the engineer, and the young boy from the caboose, all dead. I ran upstairs and dug through my wallet until I found the slip the old woman, Marta, had given me with the train. It had her name and an old address. I flipped it over. Scrawled on the back in shaky, old-fashioned script was a name and a date. Arthur, 1948. The name Arthur. George's crippled friend, the guard who tried to help. I looked at the photograph of the engine on my phone again. The little brass plate on the side of the cab. I had to zoom in, but I could make out the name stamped into the metal. Arthur's Dream. The old woman, the seller, Marta, was the engineer's wife. She had built this haunted train to complete her husband's final run, to move the lost souls. But she named it after the man who had tried to save them, Arthur. The man the foreman had struck down. The man she knew was kind.